today's talk is very special. We started to work on this conference. The first thing I told to the group is that the person I wanted to have here in Buenos Aires is actually Marx. He's like the leader of Rich Report. They made like an amazing work migrating from Ruby on Rails to Elixir. He has been working on that for a long time. We're talking about a big company, about a super big project, about Ruby on Rails developer who knows to do like Elixir all the time. I'm glad that we actually had like a lot of time to hear a lot of things from him. And I'm sure that you will have like a lot of questions. I met him actually last year in Elixir Bootcamp in New York. There was like all the Phoenix core there, and we had like a lot of amazing talk. But the talk like I liked most at that time was the one from Marx. So enjoy.
Thank you very much for the kind words, and I'm really happy to be here. I was in Argentina about 16 years ago, and I was thrilled to come back because I had a great time last time I was here, and it's been great to be here. So, Elixir adoption at scale, you can't really talk about that in 45 minutes or even 2 hours. So what I'm going to try to do is focus on some core areas that I think are important. But let's start with some background. I'm not sure how many of you know what Elixir Report is, but it's the second biggest sports site in the world behind ESPN. It's been around since about 2008. It started out as a Rails monolith. It was Rails 1.0, and then over the last 8 or 9 years, there's a lot of tech debt, as you would imagine. The landscape has changed quite a bit. In 2008, that was right after the iPhone was released, which meant that at that time, you got most of your breaking news via email. So it wasn't like you didn't get a push notification for everything, and clearly that's changed. I mean, when I flew over here, I got a push notification from Delta that my bag had gotten on the plane, which is, goes to show just how integrated things are now. And about me, I'm Elixir lead developer at Elixir Report. I don't have a formal CS background. I studied analytical philosophy and economics, and with the analytical philosophy side of things, we sort of studied the foundations of computer science. And the way we proved proofs was with functions. So object-oriented programming, while I was able to competently do it, it never felt that comfortable to me. It was always a bit confusing. It always felt like there was a lot of boilerplate and these kind of things. And functional programming was something that felt so natural because it's just functions. It's groups of functions that do things together. And so I've lived in different places in the world, and I came to San Francisco and as a Rails developer, and I did that for a few years. But I was really looking for a different kind of functional programming language. And we tried a small project with Scala at work, and that didn't work out very well. For whatever reason, it didn't click. And then I also play guitar, and I like music. And there's a framework called Overtone for SuperCollider by Sam Aaron, and it's in Clojure. And I thought, this is great. This looks fun. And I started to spend some time with that, and I finally got to the point where I was feeling competent with Clojure, and then I found Elixir. And to me, it was really amazing. Ironically enough, I never even considered Erlang as an option because I looked at Erlang and the syntax was very unfamiliar, and it had this reputation for being sort of esoteric and in the background, with telecoms, and what do I want to do with telecoms? But it was a happy set of coincidences because as soon as I started with Elixir, I was able to, because I learned a lot of the functional programming principles with Clojure, I was able to then apply those to Elixir with relative ease because it does look like Ruby, which is enough to get you into it enough until you realize that it's not like Ruby at all. So it's sort of like a bait and switch, but it worked. And at that time, I heard that Elixir Report was using Elixir, that it was, it's this big company doing these things, and this sounds great. The only thing is I'm not a sports fan. I don't care about sports at all. I have no interest in sports. Although having worked at Elixir Report for the time that I have, I now sort of by osmosis has learned a bit about sports. Like I know who won the NBA championship. It helps that it was the Golden State Warriors, who's the local team, and these are the kind of things. But also working on the back end, data's data. We could instead of Elixir Report being about sports, it could be about musical instruments or synthesizers, and it wouldn't matter because the data is still the data. We could represent the data in a very similar way that we represent the data that we have now. So that made that disconnect a little bit easier to swallow. And again, we have this new this new fancy app, and it's kind of a nice thing because it's a culmination of sort of 2.5 to 3 years of work where we started with this sort of aging platform that is shifted from desktop to mobile, and our design as well, it's sort of aging just in the same way. And we've basically, in place, rewrote our entire system, or the majority of it, in Elixir on the back end, and then we did React and Node on the front end, and now we have this nice new design. So it's really, when I say it's a company-wide effort, it really is. Like I'm talking about from the designers to the product managers to the stakeholders to all the developers and the QA and so on. We all had a hand in this. And so it's really nice to have this sort of package come together like this. And so when you say at scale, what does that mean? It's, what's it, 100 users, 1,000 users? So here's some sort of generic stats, and these are actually sort of out of date. This year we've seen big growth in all of these metrics. But this one, especially 3 billion push notifications per month, is sort of one of the reasons why we're having the issues that we were having and why we started looking at Elixir in the first place. So, in 2007, you get an email that says some breaking news happened, you go to the website, or maybe in the email itself is the contents of the article, so you don't need to go to the website. But if you send out notifications, some of our bigger subscriptions have upwards of 20 million users. So if you send a notification to 20 million users, even if 1 to 5% of those users open the app, then suddenly you have a problem, a thundering herd, right? And one of the other problems was that since it was actually a problem of prosperity in the sense that Bleacher Report became successful early on because it was the only company at the time that would allow you to follow individual players and semi-professional teams and your local teams. So you were able to follow all these different teams, different players, and so on. And when you open the app, that meant that you had to merge these all on demand. It was very difficult to cache these things. You could cache the individual stream because that's the same for everyone. But your stream is likely unique. Also, the pagination of these kind of things, so it made it very difficult to cache. And which in turn, Ruby isn't the best at merging things on the fly. So we started to see these problems where we had to invent these more and more integrated caching strategies to fake real-time updates. And everyone who's dealt with caching knows that it fails when it has to succeed the most. So we would always have a lot of problems, especially when I started when we were still on the older platform. Being on call, every developer goes on call about once a week from every month, and it wasn't a lot of fun. Like a lot of the time was spent firefighting. A lot of the time, we have offices in London as well, so that meant that if the cache doesn't bust at 3 a.m., then you wake up, you fix it, and it was a really sort of demoralizing time because developers, we like to develop. This is why we do the things that we do. Like I enjoy programming and creating things, not fixing things, not trying to keep things running. So, October 2014 was our first commit for our first Elixir app, and Elixir 1.0 had just been released. Phoenix 1.0 was still about a year away, so we were really on the edge of things, and this was a few months before I joined, and I'm kind of amazed that they sort of snuck this into the product, because we started with necessity. We started with the part of the app that needed the most help, which was the part of the app that was the most important as well. It was the part that powered all the information. Every time you open the app, it makes that call. And we decided to do that first. And part of the selling point was that the product was also seeing that we have these issues, so how are we going to fix them? And Elixir was chosen because it has all of the Elixir bullet points, concurrency, fault tolerance, availability, these kind of things. But it also looks familiar. Like I think it would have been difficult to adopt Erlang, for instance, because we would have had to teach functional programming, we would have had to teach a new language, and we would have had to teach a new syntax. We could sort of fake it with Elixir until we tricked them enough. And what's really important is that it was potentially teachable as well. Like we didn't want to, you can't develop in a silo. You can't force people or developers to do things that they don't want to do. They're not going to be around for very long. And in San Francisco, you have lots of opportunities, so developers frequently change jobs. So it's not, you have to, in many ways, keep the developers happy. So for us, it was the right combination of new technology and a serious problem that we were having. And every company has different problems. Every company has different reasons for looking into Elixir, these kind of things. But regardless of your scale, even if you don't have if you don't have this kind of scale, if you're a new company, or if you're trying to evaluate Elixir, then why would you want to do this, and how can you do it successfully? So I think I've given this talk, or different versions of this talk over time, and also just my experience with this. I think there are three tenets that you sort of have to follow in order to successfully adopt Elixir. And I'll come back to these as we go through them. But the first one is reasonable expectations. The second is consistent code. And the third is training developers. And you can't really, all these are sort of interwoven together. You can't really do one without doing the others, or they won't work very well if you don't do them all together. So let's start with reasonable expectations. So, expectations, and this is reasonable expectations between the stakeholders and between the developers as well. Because there are going to be lots of trade-offs when you're adopting a new language or any language. And when you're adopting Elixir, when we adopted it, there weren't that many guides. And basically we had to look to Erlang, and we had to use a lot of Erlang libraries to sort of fill in the gap in the meantime. And now looking back on it, it's a good thing, because EFLBA2017 has said that don't write an Elixir wrapper for an Erlang library, because Erlang and Elixir are both compiled onto Beam code, or Beam bytecode, so they should live in harmony. But there were a lot of problems in the early days with the way that different libraries version different dependencies, but that's fortunately all that's taken care of now. And one of the big things is that you have to understand is that feature development is going to slow down, because developers, if your app isn't working very well, what's the point of developing new features with it? Because they're not going to work as well, so you might as well not develop them at all. And I think this is probably the selling point for the product side of things, where they're saying, here's this potential promise for this new language. How are we going to, what are the trade-offs that we have to make in order for this to happen? And it also, you have to understand that the legacy code that we had had been written by a number of people over the years, and nothing in software is temporary. There are lots of fixes, and there are 5 or 6 years old that says this is temporary, fix as soon as possible, and these kind of things. I mean, everyone's seen that in their code base if it's been around long enough. And while in the beginning, the compromise was basically like, we need to focus on the part of the app that's having the problem, and we can continue to develop the legacy apps that are doing fine. But there's the implicit understanding that if developers are continuing to develop on the legacy app, that means you're going to have to rewrite that potentially later in Elixir. And that's okay, because when you write something, and one of the sort of the nice things about re-reporting legacy application code to Elixir was that if you've already written it once, it's a lot easier to write it again, because you already understand the logic, so that was sort of a way to expand domain knowledge and these kind of things. And while feature development slowed for a while, in the end, we'll come back to that a little bit later. And the next thing is to do it piece by piece. Like, we're a relatively small development team, about 20 or 25 developers, but we can't lose the site. The site can't go down. We can't be too ambitious. Like, everything had to be done in place, because we have users who use the app and the site all around the world, 24 hours a day. So, as I mentioned before, we focused on need-based decisions. And as I said, when you open the app, then the merging of the streams, and that was where we started to do. But we didn't just sort of say, okay, we're going to take this app offline and we're going to do this. What we managed to do was we took all of the apps and sort of all of the content streams, and whichever one was most popular, and sorted them by reverse sorted them by popularity, so that the least popular streams, like in an off year of the Olympics, there aren't going to be too many people checking a boxing or dressage stream. So we're able to sort of play around with that. And if the stream went down for an hour or half an hour or whatever, there likely weren't any users who noticed that, because no one was checking them. And this also was still in the time before Phoenix got to 1.0. So that meant that Phoenix was introducing breaking changes as well, which meant that there was a time where every week or every couple of weeks there was a new Phoenix release, and we had to go back and reevaluate the way that we were writing the code, and the way that our understanding of Elixir changed as we developed with it. So that gave us a lot of time to do the things that we needed to do to get it up to speed. And we used Nginx rewrites, or other people use HA proxy to map routes to go to based on the content type or the content stream to go to either hit the Phoenix app or to hit the legacy app. But there's a new, relatively new library called Terraform. It's written by Lauren Tan, and it's a Phoenix app that lets you basically do that, but it's much more dynamic. And it's also a really nice library because it gives you good understanding of the request and response lifecycle in a Phoenix application. So it's a really nice teaching tool as well. I mean, in our case, we had at that time about 60,000 content streams. So every time we had to update it, it was very clunky and prone to error. So there's a lot better ways to do it. And then another thing, anyone who's ever dealt with legacy code or unmaintained code is that you have API bloat, the way that the data changes or these kind of things over time, and you end up with this sort of unwieldy API that no one wants to deal with. But because you have iOS or Android clients that may or may not be able to be sunsetted, or that product won't let you sunset, you end up sticking with it and you have to keep going. And it was a bit frustrating because we're writing this new app in Elixir with this fresh new everything. Why do we have to use a legacy response? And so what we ended up doing was this very simple thing where we had a translation layer, and the new app is on the left is Elixir, and that's the nice API the way that we wanted it. The middle is a legacy app, which is also an Elixir app, and it just basically translates it so that the clients, both from the website and from the iOS and Android side, can still operate without any knowledge that anything has ever changed. And this was really nice for us because we did a lot of change over the first year of development with Elixir. Not so much in the API itself, but there was one big API change where we I think that was when we finally understood about how to model data in functional programming. And I'll come back to that towards the end. But we wouldn't have been able to do these kind of experimentations had we had to, every time we updated the API, we had to either version the API or sunset clients or these kind of things. So it bought us a lot of time to be able to do whatever we wanted to do, as long as the legacy app could translate that to the clients. So that was really helpful and instrumental in us getting our first Elixir app in production and to start seeing the benefits of Elixir. And we realized pretty quickly the benefits of Elixir in terms of server savings and just overall performance and reliability. I mean, there's still hiccups now and again, but for the most part, we were really impressed with it. So much so that at the time we thought, let's just start with this one app and then we'll see how things go. But Elixir made such a compelling case that we decided to invest even further. And this brings us to the second sort of tenet, which is consistent code. At that time, there were 2 or 3 of us that were working on Elixir apps. The rest were working on either features on the legacy apps or maintaining legacy apps. And when I say we started really early with Elixir, we just sort of guessed at how things should go. Because of our Ruby background, a lot of the early Phoenix apps had directory structures very similar to a Rails app. I don't know if people are familiar with the interactors in Rails, but we had an interactors directory, which made no sense. Interactors are basically service objects, but it didn't fit in any way in an OTP pattern. But one of the nice things about Phoenix, and that Phoenix is criticized for, is that it has similarities to Rails, but it abstracts away a lot of these things for you so that you can start using it, and so that when you do start to understand OTP concepts, you can take it in small incremental steps. And then maybe at that time you decide, Phoenix is too much and I can do it with a mix app with plug and cowboy and these kind of things. But for us it was really good because it was a teaching tool to say, here's how you do it, and once you get comfortable with that, then we can explore OTP principles and you can sneak them in as well. How do you do background jobs, these kind of things, and you can do those with OTP principles. And at this point, Phoenix had finally reached 1.0. And going back to when I first started at Bleacher Report, the reason I joined Bleacher Report was the team and because I wanted to write Elixir. And so we had this simple little embed app that would fetch embed data, try to parse embed data for articles because we collate articles and other content data from different sources, and then we try to parse the data to add that to the app. And we're having this problem. It was an internal app, but so it wasn't customer facing. But if you tried to fetch too many URLs at the same time, the app would either time out because we had a 15-second timeout on the internal thing, or it would just get too slow and it was unusable, and then we'd have tech issues filed, and it was it didn't work well. But it was really, really simple. It had one controller, just fetched, and it had models based on the content type or the different types of content. And I thought, something that does lots of simple things simultaneously, that sounds like a good case for Elixir. So, in my entrepreneurial sort of way, I wrote the app. It took about a day. We put it into production after having tested it. And having tested it, we realized that whereas the legacy app, if you add multiple URLs to fetch, the time would exponentially increase until it would time out. With the Elixir app, tiny increases per call. So we ended up, I think, we stopped measuring when we got up to 50 URLs at one time because we never have a use case for this. But it was really nice and rewarding to see how easy it was to write this simple app and to see that it performed well. So we released it in production, and that's still in production now, which is pretty cool because I think it was like my second week on the job. But given that it's a new language, and given that I was still finding out how to do things, I really had no idea how to write code, and Elixir was feeling my way. So we're going to use that as an example of how not to write code, but how through having consistent coding standards, you can make it better. So this is a function that's so long it doesn't even fit on the screen. It's terribly named. For what? That tells you nothing. Second, it does at least 3 things. Prepends a HTTP, it makes a request. Based on the response, it either returns an error at the bottom, which you can't see, or it returns a body, and it strips new line characters, and then it guesses based on what kind of content type it thinks it is, and then it returns it eventually. So clearly, I was very excited to use Elixir because I have a tuple pattern matching here. I use the pipe operator, case statement, conditional, and then even, bang method too, why not? The bang function, rather, why not? So, really bad. I mean, this is bad in any language. Like, there's no excuse that I should, with what I knew about programming at the time, I never should have done this. But, let's just, I will take that shame and carry it with me. And so, once we decided that Elixir was potentially something we could use, if I'm teaching someone else how to use Elixir, or any of you are teaching someone else how to use Elixir, and this is your example, how is that, you're going to have, it's a mess, it's not going to work. So fortunately, let's say that I refactored this, which, I did, and around that time, a library Credo came out, which has been really helpful with us to sort of standardize the way our applications look. So Credo is a static analysis tool. What's really nice about Credo is that it doesn't just tell you you're wrong and the answer. It tells you you're wrong and this is why you're wrong, and you can even you can zoom into the actual error itself and get a much more detailed response, which is really great. Because when say you have people and you're learning Elixir, and every time there's a problem, you have to go to another developer, a more experienced developer, and say, why is this doing this? Or worse, you just say, okay, this library tells me to do this, I'm going to do this and move on. Because then you don't learn anything. And also, if you continually have to ask someone else why this analysis tool is telling you these things, eventually, either A, you're going to stop asking because you're annoying the other person, or B, the other person is going to become annoyed with you because they keep getting interrupted, and developers really don't like being interrupted, as we all know. And that means that the static analysis is a very superficial thing by design. So that when there are application logic questions, those are the questions that developers come to ask other developers, and those are things that are substantive and things that you can actually walk through, and both sides will learn a bit from that. So Credo is opinionated, as every static analysis tool is, but it's really nice because it's configurable. So we sort of modified some things, and so we have basically a standard Credo configuration for all of our apps now. So now all of our apps, at least superficially, look pretty much the same, which is really great because this takes something out of a developer's hands. Like, I don't have to worry, is someone doing this, someone doing that. I know that because we have Credo hooked up to our CI, that if Credo throws any warnings or errors, then the build will fail and we'll have to fix it. So that's a real relief for everyone, because everyone over time will miss things in code reviews or whatever, but this is automatic and consistent. And as one of the really cool things about the Elixir community over the last 2 or 3 years or so is that it's evolving quite a bit, and evolving in the way that it understands how the language itself works, how Phoenix works. Like, Phoenix 1.3 is going to be a big change, and I think it's in the right direction, as was said earlier. And Ecto has changed a lot as well. Even when we started with Ecto, change sets weren't even a thing. And so change sets are basically a struct to validate data before you put it into modify it into the database. And we were doing all sorts of crazy things before change sets came out, but change sets were a real win for us and everyone else, I think. But Credo, as the versions increase, each one has a new configuration, and so we see, do we like the changes? If we like the changes, we incorporate them. If we don't, we leave them, we put them to the side. But it's nice to see everyone in the community sort of learning as we grow together. So if you run Credo, it'll tell you that this function is too long, complex, and bad, and it won't say it in that sort of terse way, but that's essentially the meaning. So the first thing that I think we should do, that I would recommend to someone with this function is, it's doing too many things. So let's break it apart into simpler functions. So this is something like this. The name is still terrible, but now it tells a story. You see exactly what's going on. Each private function does one thing. It formats a URL, gets the embed data, and it formats by content type. And another thing that I think that really changes the way that we look at things is instead of sort of guessing what kind of content we have a content type. So it declares that I am this type, I'm a tweet, I am a Facebook post, I'm a GIF, and so on. So it got rid of a lot of bugs that way, because we had a lot of bugs with sort of guessing as to what kind of content we are manipulating. And it's very explicit, and I think that, I'm not sure if this is something that Elixir or that Jose has sort of championed, or if this is sort of an Erlang thing that Elixir has adopted, but explicitness is very important. I guess even in sort of, you have to export your functions in Erlang, so maybe this is something that came from Erlang, but I like explicitness when programming. You don't guess, you say exactly what you do. And it's very extensible as well. Now, anytime we have a new content type, you can just add a new function here. And if things got too big, we could break it apart and do other things, but it's much easier to do it this way than the way we had done it before. I mean, on the previous function, you would go all the way off the stage into the first row. So in the spirit of explicitness, the next thing that I really like is typespecs and dialyzer. And Simon and Brujo talked about dialyzer and typespecs. And what I like about this is that people can argue about function naming, like what is a good function name? Because there are probably people in the audience who are like, that's a terrible name, or why would you do that? But with typespecs, it's not really up for debate. Dialyzer says you're right or you're wrong, and I think that's a really good thing. There's an article, I think it was a talk originally by Fred Bear called "The Zen of Erlang," and he has a little quote about dialyzer, and or maybe it was in the Erlang book, but never mind. The point remains the same, that he thought he'd found a bug in dialyzer, but it was turned out that dialyzer was correct and he was wrong. And to have this objective measure as to what your function does, as to what it takes and what it outputs, I think is really, really good. One of the curious things, I mean, people, I think in the Elixir community are sort of wary of dialyzer and typespec in general, because the errors that you get back are confusing and can be kind of overwhelming, especially if you retroactively decide to add typespecs and you have thousands of errors, which we sort of did, but it's another, you learn as you go. But I think with a Google search, it's very easy to find the answers to these things. So the same kind of people, who are interested in learning Elixir will probably be able to use a computer to find the result of why this error is doing this and correct it, and hopefully learn a bit more about how functions operate in Elixir. And another interesting thing is that dialyzer doesn't seem to care about the specificity. So let's use ecto change set as an example. So you can use a map, and dialyzer will pass if it returns a map. And you can use a struct as the output, and dialyzer is okay with that as well, because the struct is just a named map. And then finally, an ecto change set, it's okay with that as well, because it's just a specific struct, which I think is interesting, because I was kind of surprised that you could do this sort of cascading specificity. But the point remains the same. It's a type of map, I guess. And obviously, the more specific you can get, the better, because that's the point of doing these. So let's take a look at this function, the public function. So this is how you declare a typespec, as I think Ruho mentioned earlier. Takes a string, and it returns an embed. So what's an embed? You can define custom types, which Ruho mentioned earlier as well. And I think this is really nice. In some ways, I prefer this documentation, or I think this is easier to read than documentation because there's no subjectivity about it. I mean, you can even make a type for this and type URL, which would be even more specific, so it becomes exactly obvious what's going on. But since we already have URL here, having this here is a way for, in case your file gets bigger, you don't have to scroll up and down. This is, I think, clear enough. don't think that this is clear enough documentation-wise, because the function name is still terrible. We have no idea what it does. We know what the input and output is, but we don't really know why this is named that way. So which brings us to documentation. I think, again, something that Jose and the Elixir core team have put a lot of work in is making sure that documentation is of primary importance in Elixir. Xdoc was mentioned earlier. If you go to hex.pm and any of the documentation there, that's all formatted Xdoc. So you really have no excuse to not write good documentation. When GenStage was announced, I guess it was last year, there was a slide that Jose had where it said that GenStage had 1,000 lines of code and 1,100 lines of documentation, and that's not by accident. Like this is the thrust of something that I think the Elixir core team is really trying to push, because if you look at their libraries, they're very well documented, and it's also a really nice way to get involved in the Elixir community as well, because if something, like documentation is subjective, if you look at like some ecto function and it doesn't make sense to you, and you want to contribute and make a pull request and add the documentation, the Elixir core team seems thrilled to have people make documentation requests, because by making the documentation clear, that means more people becoming into the community, and it's also a good way to get started with open source and these kind of things. So with that in mind, let's add some documentation. So this is how you doc function, or doc there, and attempts to fetch and extract embed data for URL and format it according to the defined content type. So that's a bit nicer. And one of the nice things I think, and I don't do this in practice very often, but I think it's a nice idea, is that if you document your functions first, you have a mental model of exactly what your function should do. And that also helps with naming, and that also helps with just understanding exactly how the data should flow through your application. So with that in mind, let's rename it. So fetch and extract embed. Fine, fair enough. It's a lot better than for. But and you can, having the spec, having the doc, and then the function with this sort of readable English makes it, even someone who's never really programmed before, or as long as they can understand English, they can have some idea of what this function does compared to the beginning function, which we have no idea what that would do. And so what does all this lead up to? Like we talked about code consistency and why this is important. And this to me is sort of like the rough draft and leading up to the code review. I guess people have mixed feelings about code reviews. Like I've worked at companies that don't really do code reviews. I've worked at companies that do ineffectual or sort of menacing code reviews, which are really terrible. But I think at Elixir Report we've struck a nice balance with code reviews. And I don't think of code reviews as something to. When I first started programming, I was always a bit nervous, or like even like my first pull request at Elixir Report, I was very nervous because because coding is not a science. It's in many ways it's a creative endeavor. It's an art form because you can do a lot of things in similar ways, and you can do it in elegant ways or in inelegant ways. And it's a little creation that you made. You started out with a blank page and you created something. So if you don't have these code standards in place, you throw your code up. You have no idea how people are going to respond to the code. Maybe they have a different idea of how things should work, or so on and so forth. But since we have these standards in place, both the reviewer and the developer know exactly what to expect, and it becomes much easier. Like if you don't have these things in place, then you shouldn't submit the code for a pull request. There's a nice quote by I assume this is Francesco because this reads like Francesco. But in designing for scalability with Erlang and OTP, Erlang indeed facilitates solving many of these problems: concurrency, the bullet points, high availability, so on, so fault tolerance. But at the end of the day, it's still just a programming language. And I think this is a crucial thing because, especially with all the hype that Elixir, and a lot of it is well-deserved, but a lot of the hype of Elixir has gotten over the last couple of years, is that it's not a magic bullet, it's not some potion that will solve your problems. It's a programming language, and it does these things very, very well, but it's up to you to be vigilant and to do the due diligence in order to reap the benefits. It's not going to do it for you. So back to the code review. We've sort of gone over these bullets except for testing, so whenever a pull request is submitted, the stat analysis has already been run. Type specs are, of course, it's still work in progress, but I'd like to have all of our apps be type spec compliant. the functions are documented, and we also have API documentation elsewhere. And we have good test coverage, which I'll talk a bit more about in a bit. But this basically describes the state of the pull request before it's submitted for code review. In addition to that, we have sort of company-wide standards that we've put in place before a service, and this is not pull request dependent, but this is before an application is released into production. So we have a service review, which sort of the engineering leads come together and decide how, what's important in an Elixir app, what's important in a Node app, how do we evaluate, how do you do testing, how do you do logging. So we sort of take all of this essential, but in some ways boring stuff, and take it out of the hands of the developers and say, this is how we measure database performance, this is how we do logging, this is how we do monitoring, this is how we do error handling, and so on and so forth. So it becomes sort of a checklist. It's like, okay, I've done this, and because, if one person likes one library or one person likes another library, then, which one do I use? Is it up to me? Is it up to someone else? So by standardizing this across the company, it makes it a lot easier. And it becomes it's rote, it's boilerplate. You do it, you check it off. And what all this is leading up to is that you focus on the code in the code review. And also as a developer, you don't have to worry about which logging library do I use, or so on. And that doesn't mean that our standards don't change. It just means that at this point in time, this is how we do things, and it might change. So our standards are viscous, I guess. They're moving slowly, but they're fairly set in their ways. And by having these standards in place, it's so much easier on the developer and on the reviewer. Because, I'm just as guilty of this as anyone, but if you're busy and someone wants you to review their code, if you're looking through it and you see inconsistencies in naming or spacing, you just say, look, fix these, and then code review, push it back. And that's really the antithesis of what a code review should be. You really need to focus on the application logic. And when newer developers are doing learning Elixir, we spend a lot more time in the code reviews. And one of the really cool things about having sort of been one of the first at Elixir Report to use to learn Elixir and to start teaching other people about it is that when these people who you've been teaching start doing things in ways that you've never done, so you start learning from them as well. And I think that's a really wonderful thing to happen, to see how they have sort of understood a problem and they came up with a solution that you had no idea or that you wouldn't have done. And in turn, it becomes a two-way street. The code review is essentially an editorial review, and an editor, like if you're publishing a book, even if you're the greatest, if you're Borges or Thomas Mann or something, everyone has an editor, and having these in place means that you'll get a lot more out of it. And so the final sort of tenet or pillar is training developers. When we first started, it was sort of a self-selecting who was using Elixir, like who was interested in Elixir, and you could see who was excited about it and who wasn't excited about it. And that was okay at times. It actually worked out really well, because if everyone really wanted to use Elixir, we would have a problem because we still need to have developers maintain legacy code. So once we decided to sort of go all in with Elixir, we thought, okay, so from this point on, any consumer-facing apps would have to be written in Elixir, and maybe internal tools, we can still write those in another language, but it makes a lot more sense for some server savings for performance, we have to use Elixir. At that point, it was like there's sort of three groups, I guess. There's people who are excited about a new technology, there's people who are sort of skeptical, and there are people who just have no interest in it, and they want to do things the way that they've always done it. So you should expect some pushback. We're all creatures of habit. We all like to have our coffee the same way. We all walk the same way to work, or we do things in the same way. And to ask someone to take something that they're comfortable with and do something in an unfamiliar and different way, there's going to be some pushback. So, and sort of the way that we overcome that was, you make it as easy as possible. Don't be antagonistic. I think it was mentioned earlier that recursion was one of the difficult things that people pick up. And when teaching other developers about Elixir, I found that recursion, for whatever reason, is difficult to teach. And so one of the most often asked question was, so how do you do a for loop in Elixir? Well, you recurse. And it's one of those things that you don't have to understand. You either understand it or you don't. And so making it easy means that you will sit down and you'll go over it. You start with the simple case and then you build up. And then it's pretty wild to see how quickly the light goes on in their eyes, and then suddenly they know recursion, and they go back and they do the things that they want to do. And another thing, by having these in-person code reviews for newer developers, it means that you can sit down and go over the code. And one of the things that we found to be successful is that tests matter. Of course, tests matter in any context. But when you're teaching someone about a new language, XUnit, for instance, is very easy to use. It's very easy to get up and running. It's very easy to cover your test cases. And we use another library called XCoveralls, so we can measure test coverage. It measures percentage, but I don't really care if you have 96% coverage or 99% or 100%. That doesn't, you can, if you have 100% unit tests, then things are not going to potentially behave the way you expect them to. They, on Twitter every now and again there'll be something like, oh look, only unit tests, and the door will flop back and forth. But XCoveralls will also show you the code that you have covered, so you can have a much more confident idea of if the tests are effective or not. And so by having these tests in place, then that means that you can sit down and you can refactor confidently, because if the tests don't pass, then your application probably doesn't, it's not behaving as expected. People were, as you would expect, writing a lot of Ruby-ish code, myself included. When I started, I was sort of using Ruby idioms in Elixir, and they sort of worked, because it worked, but it wasn't idiomatic. And so teaching people how to move away from if statements, or using case statements, or using function definitions, this is a really nice way to teach them how to do that. And it worked really well, because all of our backend developers are Elixir developers now. And so it's ups and downs, right? But I think it's a testament to the system that we put in place, and also our developers who are keen to learn this new language. Another thing that people ask is, so how do you find Elixir developers? If you have to hire developers, there aren't that many Elixir developers. Do you hire Erlang developers, or what are the qualifications that you look for? So when I first started at Elixir Report, we did sort of the whiteboard interview, where you do some sort of tricky question, and if you memorize it, then you memorize it, and you can do it to the end of time. But it doesn't really test it's not how your day-to-day life works. So since we are traditionally a Ruby shop, we give them basically our interview process works with, you do a phone interview just to sort of see, if they are who they said they are on their CV. It's a nice way to gauge interest in Elixir. Are you following Elixir news? Who these people are. What these libraries do. It's a good selecting process. And then, depending on whether the person is familiar with Elixir or not, we'll give them a coding challenge, which is essentially a take-home test that's very similar to a ticket that you would do at work. Like depending on if you're a junior developer or senior or so on, we'll adjust the test accordingly. But what we'd like to measure through the test is not how well do you know Ruby or how well do you know Elixir, but it's how do you design an API? How do you think critically? Like, these are things that you can't really teach. I can't teach someone to think critically, but if they know Ruby really well and can think in a critical way, then it's pretty likely that we can transfer those skills to Elixir. So that's how we've hired Elixir developers to have come on and start writing Elixir almost immediately. Sort of one of the, I guess, good things and bad things-ish about Elixir is that because our platform is so stable now, we don't have to hire as many people, so we're doing a lot more with a lot less, or with the same. So that's a good thing as well. So I've talked for a while about these different things, and they probably all sound well and good, but are they effective? How have we been able to measure success? First of all, it's an ongoing process. I mean, it's 3 years now. We're still porting legacy code. The last sort of chunk, I really hope that we have done by the end of the year, because that'll be a release for everyone. And as I mentioned earlier, our standards are changing as we understand how to do Elixir better, how to write better Elixir code. Also, we move from monolith to sort of microservices-y type architecture. And as we understand how Elixir works, we've switched things around a lot. So I imagine that in a year or 2 years, our infrastructure or our platform will look very different than it is now. And we have sort of a vision for where it is. It's just a matter of figuring out the best way to get there. Second, mistakes happen. I mean, even if you're an experienced programmer in a language that you're familiar with, you're going to make mistakes. When we sort of decided to redo some of the schema, we ended up having the site go down for a few hours, or it was a problem. But this is why when we talk about the beginning about having reasonable expectations, is that by sort of front loading that potentially there will be problems, there weren't any dust ups between product and the developers. We all understood that we were working towards a common goal. So the outages are never good, but we're moving towards something better. And because we had this promise up front, it was a lot easier to work through those together. And contrast rapid development to what I started in the beginning, where feature development slowed. Once we had gotten the first iteration of our app in production and it was performing well, suddenly product was like, okay, so we waited for a year to get these features. Now it's our turn to give us what you promised us. And one of the asks for a long time was different content types. Like, sort of, I guess what makes Bleacher Report unique now is that we have a voice that people really like. There's an article that called us the MTV of sports, which is funny because it feels like MTV is faded, and so it sounds like the person who wrote that article was probably in their 40s, trying to imagine what kids do these days. But comments appreciated, it's still appreciated. But what that gets us, the point is that what makes Bleacher Report unique now is the way that we tell the story. And if you only have a limited number of content types, it's harder to tell the story. So I think when we got the Elixir app in production, we had 5 or 6 content types. And I think there are 7, 8, 9, something like that, that had been on the back burner for product for a long time. And this was when we decided, okay, the way that we've been doing things, having these sort of tightly coupled models to the database, video type or so on, that's not really a very good way to do it. It's very cumbersome, and it's difficult because every time you add a new content type, you have to add a new table or make a migration. And so we thought, change sets, this is a great way to do this. So we were able to take these change sets and make a more generalized database for just generic content that had sort of almost every type of content has common fields, and then other ones have more specific fields. But it was a way for us to quickly add all these other content types. So this was a really nice way for a new developer to contribute to an Elixir app immediately. So I'll give you a quick. So this is an insert change set function. One of the asks for a long time was that you be able to change the content type. So just like when you see breaking news, they'll start with a tweet, and then they'll have an article or a video or something to explain it in more detail. And this is what we wanted to do on the app as well. First, get the tweet up so people come to the app, or they'll get a push notification immediately, and the app will either by the time they open it, there'll be an article up, or they'll still have the tweet, and then if they go back to it, the article will be in place. And that was really, really difficult to do before because, again, we were trying to guess which kind of content types. But here we explicitly say this is this content type, and we have an insert change set and an update change set function because they behave in slightly different ways when we want to change a content type. And another sort of thing that, in hindsight, was really obvious was that, if you look at the documentation for change set, they have a def change set, or if you do in a Phoenix app, it'll do a def change set. And it sort of clicked. It's like you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter. It's just a function. There's no sort of magic here. It's just a function, which meant that we could cast it into a change set, and then we could do whatever we wanted with that based on the change set. So here we have the content type, which let's say it was, an article. Then it would validate based on that article type. So here's an example. And this is sort of what it looks like with a lot of the stuff omitted, but nevertheless, you can see what's going on. So you have article, GIF, photo, and so on. And then each of these validations can be validated independently, and you can combine them if, just because it's just, it keeps saying it's just functions, but that's really what it is. And it makes it really, really simple and really easy to change these things. So what used to take like a day for a developer to do and involve migrations and these kind of things, then took a couple of hours. And it was really cool because the developer who was just learning Elixir could do a very small number of lines of code, and then here in the app you can see this is a discrete part of the app that you did and that you did in a new language, and it was really cool. And because we're able to do these so quickly, we did all of the remaining content types in a couple of weeks, and then product suddenly had a problem of too many options. So now we have all these options, we don't know how to use them effectively in the app. So there haven't been any more asks for content types for a while because we're still sort of evaluating how to do these correctly. But it's been really important to develop the voice of Bleacher Report and to develop how we want to tell the story of the content types, of the streams. And one of the things that we focused on this year more, if you open the app, you can see that we have sort of event-based or news-based streams. So if you're a, I don't know, Boca fan or a River fan, right? Yeah, Boca. Let's say Boca. Then and they have a. I'm really bad with sports, so as I said, they have a soccer match. They have a game. Anyway, something happens with Boca, and so we'll create a stream based on that event. So then you can tell the story, and if you're a Boca fan, we can present that to you in a way that if your team is winning, we can make it a very happy stream, and if your team is losing, we can convey that emotion that you would expect for a team, for how you would feel as a fan if your team is losing. It's going to be a different experience, and we want to reflect that on the app, and that's been something that we've been able to do with this and with Elixir in general. And another way to measure how successful we've been with this is to see the number of contributors on all of our Elixir apps, because I made this claim that we trained all of our backend developers and we have consistent code, so we should be able to see that reflected somewhere. And the number of contributors is a nice way to do it. So this is the monolith that has been around since the beginning of time, Bleacher Report time. And there have been 59 contributors, which you would think would be every developer who have worked at Bleacher Report over the history of the company. But I have not made a single contribution to that, which I'm very proud of. I haven't even cloned the repo, which is nice. It was probably the best decision I made after joining Bleacher Report. But now let's look at the Elixir apps. So this is the first Elixir app, 23 contributors, and it's been almost 3 years in production, or 3 years in existence. This OEmbed app that I talked about at the beginning, 12 contributors, about the same amount of time. And this new app is a metadata app, and it's been in production for about 10 months. And 10 people have already worked on that. And considering we only have 25 developers total, I think that's pretty good claim, validation of that claim. And I think we have about 12 Elixir apps in production now. But this metadata app I leave here because we've been able to, we have this very stable platform now, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more. But we've been able to do these sort of, secondary applications like this metadata app. Like one of the things that Bleacher Report focused on in its early days was having very high-ranking SEO metadata and these kind of things. And when things shifted to mobile, we stopped sort of, for whatever reason, putting an emphasis on SEO. And I don't really know much about SEO, but various things had fallen. And because we had these spare developer hours, who was like, this is something that we can do, this relatively low-hanging fruit. And we did this metadata app, and so now basically every piece of every article that you read on Bleacher Report, or every time you load a page on Bleacher Report, we have a massive amount of data about that, and it depends on if it's breaking news, it has different data. If it's a game, it has different data. And it was a relatively simple app to write, but it's something that has paid off really, really well for us. And sort of the final claim is the NFL draft. It's the State of the Union, essentially. You can't. Some of our biggest traffic spikes have been through unexpected breaking news, and before the NFL draft, our biggest traffic spike was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe it was longer. Whenever LeBron James went from Cleveland to the Heat, that was our highest number of concurrents. And that was it was expected because he was going to announce something, but it wasn't like the NFL draft. So the NFL draft is consistently either our highest traffic night of the year or one of the highest. And this last draft was in April, and it was the first year that all of our core components had been on Elixir. And it was really important that this doesn't fail, because in the past, like 4 years ago, there was some problems with the draft, and basically the draft is the barometer for how well the engineering team is doing, so everyone takes this very seriously. And I was very nervous because I've been championing Elixir, and I'm generally an anxious person, especially with these kind of things. And because computers always fail, something always goes wrong. And because nothing can go wrong, everyone's on call, everyone's in the office. But I think that draft started at 5 and it went until 9 p.m. Pacific time. And in the past year, we stayed around until 8:39 just to make sure everything was going well. So the draft started. We're all sort of nervous. We're sitting around. We have the analytics dashboards up waiting. And the first pick goes in, and all of our phones start, we get the chirp for the notification of success. That's great. Things are working. And then traffic spiked to the point where it was our highest number of concurrents by more than 30,000, and within about 15 minutes. So our traffic, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a huge spike, and I'll show it in a second. And it hovered there for a while, and we have sort of rough times about where we feel like we can handle traffic, and it was fine. It sort of stuck there. Everything was working. We were just sitting there, and it was a really nice feeling. And by about 6 o'clock, we were eating tacos, and then about 6:30, everyone went home, and it was by far the most successful draft we've ever had, and it was really a testament to everyone in the development side, on the product side, that we've been able to pull this off. Basically moving in part from a legacy system to a brand new system, and one that performed really, really well. Since I can talk forever, apparently, our push notifications was another thing that really, really, really excelled. I'll just give a quick blurb, but it was really, if you talk to your stakeholders and say, we want to do this new thing, this new language, because it gives us concurrency, whatever, it sort of goes over their head, what does that do for me, and what have you done for me lately? The push notifications was something that if you can consistently deliver notifications the fastest, then people are going to be more likely to use your app. But if you deliver notifications consistently, then people are going to move to a competitor's app or not rely on your app at all. So we had our previous iteration was kind of clunky. You had to do all these slow operations, and then it sent out all the notifications at once. On the new Elixir app, it immediately starts sending out notifications. So within 100 milliseconds before a second, you end up getting the app. And I was at a basketball game. We got tickets through work, and the game had just ended. My phone buzzed with the final score. So it was really nice, and it was something that the product people know because they have the competitors' apps and our apps, and when our app is consistently faster, it's a validation of that. The people who program the streams, like the content programmers, they were like, what have you guys done with this? This is amazing. It works so much better now. And people on Twitter responded positively, which is always a nice and somewhat rare thing, but to express their support and admiration for the new push notification system. So that was a really nice one. So these are the spikes for the first night of this is the weekend of the NFL draft. This is Thursday. This is Friday night, and you can see as each round of the draft happens, there's less traffic. Our traffic was already spiky because of trade rumors or draft pick whatever's were, sports things happen. And so clearly we had some big spikes. But how did we perform? This is in hundreds of seconds. So this is like 1/20th of a second, and this our highest spike was almost like 1/3 of a second, which is pretty good. We want to have, our goal is to have everything sub 100 milliseconds, so these outliers kind of bother me, but I think that that by all measures, it's generally good and validates that we are having success with Elixir. And from a personal standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, this gives us time to spend time developing. I don't like fighting fires. I don't like being woken up in the middle of the night to deal with a caching problem. I really enjoy what I do, and I think all of us probably enjoy developing, or we wouldn't be here learning about new things. And it's really demoralizing to not spend time developing. And I think that obviously Bleacher Report has benefited. Obviously, the developers have benefited. But for me personally, in addition to that, I get to do what I enjoy without being interrupted, or without being interrupted less. And so that's a really, really, really great thing that, for me, this is the core of why you should consider adopting Elixir, because you get to spend time doing what you love. And I don't know if Francesco's here, but he always talks about telecom availability. We're not quite there yet, but we're working towards it. It's a goal that we want to have. And finally, Jose Valim, Bruce Tate, and I are writing a book called Adopting Elixir. So you don't have to trust me. You have much better sources to trust than Jose and Bruce. But it should be out towards the end of the year. And the whole idea is that there was sort of a gap in the market between learning the language and how to apply all of the things. So this should be a less rambly version of the talk with much more information. And the idea is that you can get the information you need to know to, once you understand the language, this will help you get it into production and monitor and all these things. So I think that it'll be really good if this is something you're considering. So, and finally, any questions?
Questions?
Hi. Well, actually, the question I was thinking of right before your last slide was, how do I get from concept to production? So, since that book isn't done yet, where do I learn really to, like, how to do Elixir in production right? Like, books, tutorials, or more like communities, like channels, or reference open source apps? What's the best path today?
There's a wealth of information about Elixir online now, and you can always look at how Erlang does a lot of these things as well, because you can learn a lot from that. The Elixir Slack channel is really warm and welcoming, and they will answer most questions, which is one of the really nice things about the Elixir community, is that it's very inclusive and very welcoming. So between there's also like Elixir Radar. I think that's the Platform Tech weekly newsletter, which covers all sorts of topics. And then there's Elixir Weekly, which is by Renee, who's the author of Credo. So those are also good sources to find information. So I think that should probably cover it. And the book should be out before the end of the year. So yeah, so it's not too much longer.
Okay, can't wait.
I have two questions. The first one, as a former Ruby developer, well, what was the hardest part for you to start working on Elixir and start doing it okay? My second question is, how much of the great success that you had with the Elixir app was from Elixir, and how much is from all the previous knowledge that all the developers on the team were having from the legacy app? Just a rough estimate.
So I think that it's probably twofold. One is we understood the problem better, so that when we rewrote in Elixir, it was better because it was a different sort of mentality. Like 8 years ago, desktop traffic was most important, and now mobile traffic is the most important. But we actually, this was before I joined, but the developers then wrote the same app in Ruby as a proof of concept and wrote it in Elixir, and the Elixir app outperformed the Ruby app. So I think I don't have details because this was before I joined, but there was from a business standpoint, they didn't really want to use a new language. We've been using Ruby forever, so why would you use something on a relatively untested language? But the Elixir app outperformed it, and we actually tried to do some sort of crazy thing with threads in Ruby to mimic concurrency, and if you've done threads in Ruby, you know that it's going to bite you at some point, and it really caused us some problems. So I think that even with the domain knowledge, I think that the Elixir app would have outperformed the other app. But as mentioned earlier, like Elixir and Erlang are good for many things, but some things are not good at doing. So as long as you fall within that domain, I think Elixir is the better choice. Oh, and not just for Ruby, I think that it is a paradigm shift. Just because with multi-core built in, I think 1997 was when the research team at Ericsson first started with multi-core Erlang, and then so Erlang or multi-core support wasn't an afterthought; it was built into the language, or the VM rather. So just by the fact that as the number of cores increase, like Elixir or Erlang will become more efficient. So I think that it's hard to make an argument for anything other than Elixir, not Java or Python or whatever, what may have you, unless it's something that Erlang that the VM isn't very good at doing. And then, sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Oh, sorry. As a Ruby developer, I'm assuming that you were a Ruby developer, was the hardest part for making the shift from one to the other?
Let's see. I think because I had experience with functional programming with Clojure in the past, I think that would have been the hardest, would be in the recursion and sort of understanding the immutability, and that would have been the hardest. But I think the hardest part was sort of figuring out how to monitor and how to measure how an app is performing, not just because with the Ruby apps in production, if the CPUs got too high, then we added another instance. With the Elixir apps, it doesn't. CPUs doesn't seem to be a very good metric for monitoring how your app is performing. And then we started using Elixir. That was probably the hardest thing, was dealing with the Erlang libraries and trying to parse the Erlang code and trying to resolve dependencies. That was really difficult to do, especially with Elixir, because there are 5 or 6, 7 different dependencies. So in our mixed file, we had to include all the dependencies and then override through all of them. And then whenever any one of them updated one of their libraries, then we had to go through that process again and again. So that was the frustrating part, I think, was just dealing with the dependencies in the beginning.
Any other questions?
I think you partially already talked about it, but I'm curious about how, I understand the decision was made before you enter, but how do you sell, to people that makes the decision to making a shift to such a young technology? You treat it like an experiment, and then you see how that's handled.
Yeah, I think at the time, I think the sort of candidates were Node, Go, and Elixir, and there was a proof of concept and a lot of the things that I've talked about, like documentation, concurrency, and these things, that was sort of the selling point. Also, the fact that Elixir is new, but Erlang is not new, and in the event that for whatever reason Elixir failed to take off, we could always move back to Erlang, because if we learn how to use Elixir, then we can probably learn the Erlang syntax and figure out how to do that. So I sort of hedged our bets, but it was a really big gamble, and it could have blown up horribly wrong, but it worked out really well.
Hi, you mentioned that now you have kind of microservices. Could you expand a little on that, on how you communicate? Are you using anything of the OTP or something like that?
Yeah, so part of what we did was taking things piece by piece. So we sort of identified functionality and moved into a service, and what you'd expect. And for a lot of the apps, we're using HTTP calls, and now we're moving towards message-based with RabbitMQ. But our priority was get this working. It doesn't have to be the best solution. Like, we have a lot of things that we can improve on, and sort of how each service talks to each other is one of them. Another thing is deployments. Like, when we started, there weren't really any resources on how to do it, so we put the app in a container and then put it on Elastic Beanstalk, which again is not ideal, but it's worked well enough for us. And now that we've now that we've solved the problems that were causing us all these headaches, now this is another goal, is to reevaluate how the services talk to each other, how they're structured, and also how we deploy the apps.
Hi there. So I was wondering, right now in the project I'm working in, we're trying to make the decision if we move maybe from like a REST API to protocol buffers or flat buffers. And I was wondering if you have any experience on that, because I've seen very little libraries or good libraries for flat buffers, for instance, for Elixir or Erlang.
Yeah, so every month we sort of have an architecture review board meeting, and we sort of decide like for longer term projects, and coincidentally enough that came up last month, and that's something that we're going to evaluate, I think, in better ways to, instead of using REST or JSON, to use something else. So I don't really have an answer for that, but it's something that we're considering.
Any other question?
My question is, with your experience on the market, I heard you mention that you do some interviews and you interview candidates for this, and maybe you train a lot of people. So my question will be, how easy is to meet or to get Erlang programmers in the US market?
I think it depends on the industry, I think. But for us, like, we actually haven't interviewed any Erlang programmers. All of the applications or the applicants that have come to us have either been Ruby developers who were interested in Elixir, or sort of Elixir, like starting out Elixir developers who wanted to work with Elixir full time. But we have a monthly meetup like 2 years ago, we started the Elixir meetup in SF, and then there's an Erlang meetup that had been around for a lot longer, and so I was one of the organizers of that, and then Francesco and I can't remember his name, it's going to kill me. Francesco and Kevin, it's terrible. Kyle, oh, thank you. I'm Patterson, I know his last name, I can't remember his name, Mr. Patterson. We sort of chatted and thought that it would be a good idea to combine the two. And it's been nice to see because we can see sort of what each other community is doing, because the Elixir community can learn a lot about the Beam, and we can also, and the Elixir, or the Erlang community can sort of learn about different things that the Elixir community is doing. So to answer your question, I think that on most of our meetups, we have, I think, probably 3/4 to our Elixir developers and 1/4 are Erlang developers. So, but I think most of the Erlang developers are employed as Erlang developers, whereas probably half of the Elixir developers are just hobbyist Elixir developers.
Another one. Is there any certification, or I know they already asked you about materials, but is there any certification or, I don't know, course that will take you to pick one candidate over the other?
No, I mean, Erlang Solutions has a nice Elixir and OTP certification that they do at various workshops in different places. So that.
Simon as well.
Oh, and Simon as well, yes, with the Erlang course and other courses. So obviously, if you've completed that, then that shows not only that you're interested, but that because it's, I'm interested in a lot of things, but I'm not competent in those things necessarily. But if I've gone to the effort to get certified with one of these courses, then that's a big leg up, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, I actually have one question for you.
Before we finish,
I have one question for you. Yeah. So I heard that you started mostly with Ruby developers that they were training into Elixir. So how long did it take for you to train like a Ruby developer into Elixir, and how long? What was the invest, and how long did it take until he actually became productive in Elixir?
I mean, it depends on the person. Some people pick up things quicker than others, but if you basically would start, they would learn using like the programming Elixir book or the Phoenix book, just to understand like the semantics and syntax of the language, and then we would give them small sort of chunks of functionality that existed on legacy code or stuff that they'd written, and then they could rewrite it into Elixir because they could sort of fake it or do it as well as they could, and then having the in-person code reviews was a way for us to teach more idiomatic Elixir. And I'd say like 2 to 3 weeks before their first bit was into production, and then a couple of months and they're working on like an app by themselves or with a team. So.